Good morning. My name is Julie Smith-Bartoloni. I'm the Senior Director of Donor Relations here at the Boston Foundation. I'm so delighted to have all of you. Thank you so much for being here this morning. This is a really special day and a really special week. And when we started talking about the Finding Fay Festival, the Boston Foundation was really honored and privileged to be asked to be a part of this week. We have had the privilege of knowing Fay as a member of our community of donors for many, many years. And through the Boston Foundation, Fay has been an incredible philanthropist to the arts organizations of Boston. It's really touching to see and meet all of you today and hear the many ways that you all knew Fay, from family to friends to colleagues, to knowing her as an artist or as a philanthropist. It is clear that Fay touched so many lives, and we are truly privileged to be able to be the kickoff event for this incredible week of Finding Fay. The Boston Foundation it's really an interesting time in our own history, because on Monday, on Labor Day actually, it was our 100th birthday. So happy birthday to the Boston Foundation. This is a year of celebration for the Boston Foundation as we're in our centennial year. We have a number of events that are culminating in our gala on December 2nd, and it's really very special to be able to have this tribute to Fay today as part of that centennial year. When I was speaking with Heron and we were speaking with Appy and his family about what to do for today, we started thinking about a lot of different ideas for this morning. And really what we came up with is this morning's breakfast as an appreciation to all of you, to our community of donors and friends, without whom this past 100 years would have meant nothing and the next 100 years wouldn't be in existence. So really, we're very, very grateful to all of you. And I want you to feel appreciated because this is really a very special moment for all of us. So I'm delighted to be able to give you all the gift today of both Fay Chandler, Fay's son, and also Sebastian Smee, who needs no introduction for those of you who are so deeply connected and entrenched in the art world. But he will be introduced by my colleague, James Burnett, who is our Director of Public Relations, who also came to us from the Boston Globe. So in a few minutes, James will introduce Sebastian, and then you'll also have an opportunity to meet Allison. Where did you go, Allison Esposito, who is our newest addition to the Boston Foundation. She is our program officer for arts and culture, newly arrived from Chicago, and we're thrilled to have her as well. So with no further introduction, let me just say thank you so much again for being here. Please enjoy the breakfast and the morning and this entire week of Finding Fay.
I definitely can't top that. So, good morning. I'm James Burnett. I'm the Director of Public Relations and Social Media here at the Boston Foundation. I admit that I have not met most of you, but a few of you may know that before I joined the foundation earlier this year, I was a journalist. I spent 16 years writing for newspapers and contributing to broadcast outlets from the Financial Times and the Boston Globe to CNN and CBS News. And I loved the work, but there was one lament that I had about it, and that was the old adage of not stopping to smell the roses. And any journalist will tell you that in a newsroom, that means not taking out the time to get to know your coworkers and to recognize the work that they do. Because we can spend so much time looking outward that we never look in. It's a little loud. Here in Boston and at the Boston Globe, that one journalist that everyone stops to pay attention to is Sebastian Smee. And I know he'll probably want to kill me for saying that, but he is that person. His work is dynamic. His coworkers appreciate it as much as the work that they seek when they're looking to fill the newspaper. And so it was a pleasure to know him and to work with him. If you don't know, Sebastian came to the Boston Globe in 2008 after working in his native Australia and in the UK for several years as well. In 2011, he reached the pinnacle of print journalism, winning the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism. In explaining their selection of Sebastian, the Pulitzer jury described his work as vivid and exuberant writing about art, often bringing great works to life with love and appreciation. Sebastian is the author of the books Lucian Freud and Side by Side, Picasso vs. Matisse. Please join me in welcoming Sebastian Smee to the Boston Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you, James, so much. I really appreciate it. What a lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's a real privilege to be here at the Boston Foundation. Appy, that was so moving. It was so wonderful to learn about your mother. This weekend, these 3 days of events are going to be absolutely fantastic, so I encourage everyone to attend and bring whoever they can. I'll certainly try to get to it myself. Yeah, it was just a very special, a special talk because I didn't know much about your mother, much to my shame. I'm still learning, even though I've been here 7 years, about such key figures in Boston's art society. But what a great life she led and what great things she made happen. As I said, thank you so much for having me here. James was a great colleague at the Globe, and I was so touched when he invited me to be here, so I didn't hesitate to say yes. I've just come back from 4 weeks back in Australia, which is where I was born, as James said. And it's unusual, you know, whenever you spend time in your hometown, if you do live somewhere else, you inevitably get into that sort of mental anguish and that phase of kind of comparing everything. And of course, I'm acutely conscious that when we go back to Australia, the Australia we see it's not a realistic Australia for us because we're spoiled by family. We have an incredibly busy social calendar. We catch up with friends, and the weather there, even though it's winter there right now, was glorious. So we went to the beach a lot and ate really well. It was ridiculous. And you start going through that thought experiment of, you know, do we want to move back here? And give our kids, especially, my kids are sort of 8 and 10 years old, and I think one of the things we think is, do we want them to have an experience of growing up in Australia, at least for a year or so? But I say all that only to say that when we come back here, we really do feel like it's home. We've been here these 7 years, just over 7 years, and the welcome that was afforded us from the very moment we arrived surprised us. It really did. And we've just been richly rewarded, I feel, in terms of the experiences that we've had. My wife is a violinist. She worked at the Sydney Opera House 4 nights a week playing for the Opera and Ballet Orchestra. And it was tough to be yanked away from that. She still does perform, but she is also teaching in the Somerville public school system, and it's something, Appy, that maybe you know, your mother would appreciate it, the kind of work that she does. James has written about it in the Globe, funnily enough, not about my wife, but about the program that goes on there. They're incredibly supportive of music for kids. They have a huge rental program of instruments so that large swathes of the Somerville community who otherwise probably wouldn't have the opportunity to play musical instruments get that chance. And she just loves the work. So that's her. And for myself, I really couldn't imagine being in a better part of the world for stimulation in terms of art. And it's been an unbelievable 7 years, just objectively speaking, for art in Boston and in the New England area generally. I didn't quite grasp, I think, before I came here, how richly endowed this part of the world is in terms of museums and art offerings. And that, for me, has been the great opportunity, the great discovery. I knew, of course, about the famous museums. I knew about the MFA, I knew about the Gardner Museum, I knew about the Peabody Essex Museum, I knew about the Clark out in Williamstown. But of course, there are so many more. I should have mentioned Harvard, of course. But that's been one of the great revelations, how many great college collections there are in New England. And for me, it's a real privilege to have as my beat not just Boston, but New England generally, because it really is astounding how much there is to see. And as I say, these last 7 years have been especially amazing because of the amazing number of new buildings, refurbishments, renovations. I mean, so many of the great institutions of New England, art institutions, have improved themselves in untold ways, but often in terms of bricks and mortar. And of course, bricks and mortar means money. And so it really has been an extraordinary story of philanthropy. And that, I think, is surprising to many people. It's been surprising to me. When I first arrived, a lot of people said, you know, Boston's philanthropic scene is not necessarily as generous as you might think. Well, I can tell you the last 7 or 8 years have completely destroyed that. Even if that was a myth, it just holds no water at all. Just think about the sums involved. Shortly after I arrived, well, within a couple of years, the Museum of Fine Arts opened its new Art of the Americas wing, which cost something like $500 million. Slightly less, but that's how much they raised approximately. Money went to the endowment and so on. The Gardner Museum has a new wing. The Renzo Piano building that cost more than $100 million. You have the old Fogg Museum, now Harvard Art Museums, has had a huge project, and it reopened very recently, as many of you know, and it looks fantastic, I think. Massive sums of money involved in that as well, 400 million or more. Yale University Art Gallery, which is part of my beat, also has renovated. Amazing job Jock Reynolds did there. The Peabody Essex Museum is in the middle of new renovations and plans and has raised a staggering sum of money for that. The ICA, of course, had only just opened before I got here, and Jill Medvedov and all the people who supported the ICA did amazing things to get that happening in this city. And it's something, the whole city, I think, should be incredibly proud of. So, and I've just, scratched the surface. Almost every institution of note has had some kind of renovation or new building in the last 20 years. Many of them are college museums. And so for me, I forgot to mention the Clark. I mean, I did mention it before, but of course they have just reopened with their amazing new building designed by Tadeo Ando. And there's Mass MoCA as well nearby there. So it just goes on and on and on. And for me to have these places as my beat and be able to go and visit them and see how they've changed at such a rapid rate has been fantastic. In the end, for me as an art critic, I don't particularly care about sums of money or new buildings. I care about art. That's what it's all about for me. And in some cases, I'm a little bit suspicious of institutions and the purposes they sort of want art to be roped into, whether it's communal or political or whatever. Most of those purposes are usually well intended, but we can sometimes forget that it's about creativity, it's about individuals making art, and it's about individual people responding with their heart, with their soul, with their brain to the art that they see. And when I write criticism, I always try to keep that foremost in mind. One of the great pleasures I've had and privileges working for the Globe has been to write about individual works of art. I think that often when we go to museums, we only go because we've heard there's a new show on. And there are many great shows on all the time, and that's the main part of my beat. But whenever I go to these college collections or these bigger museums, I always try to spend as much time as I can walking around the permanent collections of these places. And they're what are so staggering, really. I mean, especially coming from Australia, where we have a really dynamic contemporary art scene in Sydney and in Melbourne and some other cities, and where we have a smattering of good museums. We simply don't have the depth of collections that this part of the world has. And the reason that institutions here have those collections, of course, is again because of philanthropy. Decades and decades, centuries of incredibly generous giving. And it's a shame to my mind if people forget about the permanent collections. And so I spend as much time as I can walking around them after seeing shows and sometimes before, and occasionally just visiting museums for that purpose alone. And when I was sort of thinking about this and being amazed at the depth of offerings, I proposed to my editors at the Globe that I write a column where I pick out an individual work of art and just write about that. And it would have to be a work in a permanent collection. It would have to be on display. It couldn't be on loan. It had to be owned by that museum. They were to be my parameters, but otherwise I had complete freedom to do what I wanted. And they supported that idea. They said, that sounds great. It took 6 months or almost a year to actually get going. But once it did, I was just very fortunate that it got a very warm response. And I think it's because it was really bringing to people's attention the amazing variety of things that we have on display in permanent collections around New England. The column is called Frame by Frame, and it's just one of the, the pleasures of my job to walk around thinking, right, what will I do next? What will be my next frame by frame? And it can be an ancient Egyptian artist's palette, at RISD. It could be a video work at the Rose Art Museum. It could be, a wonderful Japanese screen at Harvard Art Museums. It can be absolutely anything. And so I really do enjoy that part of my job. A lot of people, when I first arrived here, were just stunned at the fact that the Boston Globe had hired someone from Australia to be an art critic. And I can't tell you the number of times I'd meet people on the street or through friends, and they'd say, "So what do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm an art critic." And they'd say, "Oh, right, where do you work?" "Oh, the Boston Globe." But where are you from? This accent's a bit strange. Where are you from? And I'd say, "Well, I'm from Australia." And then there'd sort of be a pause as they'd compute, and they'd say, "The Boston Globe hired an art critic from Australia?" And it really was shocking to a lot of people. And the funny thing is, I didn't know how to take that, but I realized about 6 months later how fluky and how fortunate I really was. And I feel forever grateful to the Boston Globe for having the audacity to do this. It was a big and expensive thing to bring me over for interviews and then to help my whole family move over here and give me a tremendous amount of support in those first 6 months. I realized that, it was shocking 6 months later because, of course, then 2008 happened, sort of a month after we bought a house, and we woke up to a headline, front page of the Boston Globe saying, "New York Times threatens to shut down the Globe." And here I was, with my young family in Boston, thinking, wow, this might not have been such a great move after all. And of course, everything settled down and worked out well, but it's been a tough time for newspapers everywhere. And I don't think it would be possible for the Globe to justify the kind of action they took in employing me. Even now, perhaps now things have settled down. We have a new owner, of course, John Henry, and he's been investing very generously in the company. But certainly for the next 5 or 6 years after we moved, I think it was almost impossible for anyone who knew the Globe to envisage them making that kind of a move again. So I feel so grateful that it happened for me in that narrow window of opportunity, because I haven't looked back. I've been so lucky here. My colleagues are brilliant. James was such a great colleague I mentioned. I've got people like Jeremy Eichler, the classical music critic, who's one of my dearest friends and such a great writer. Ty Burr, Mark Feeney, Pulitzer Prize winner. It's such a strong group of arts writers especially and critics. And I haven't mentioned many of them, but it really is a great group of people, and I'm so glad that people are continuing to read the Globe, and I hope that they're conscious of how much the top hierarchy really do back coverage of the arts, which I think is incredibly important. And it's one of the ways in which a newspaper can distinguish itself in a nationally and internationally competitive atmosphere. The arts are mostly local. Film and TV can be different, but certainly classical music, museums, visual art, they are local. And unless you have writers writing about these shows that are going on and these permanent collections, then they might not get the coverage that they deserve. And I can tell you they deserve a lot more coverage than we're giving them. But certainly at the Globe, we're doing our very best. And we know that it's a huge part of what makes this part of the world, not just Boston, but this area of the world, great. So I've talked enough for now, but if James wants to come up and we can have a bit of a conversation, we'd also love to take any questions that you may have about anything at all. Thank you very much for listening to me. You happy there? Yeah.
So thanks again.
Not at all. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I hate to put you on the spot.
No, you didn't.
I actually enjoy it. You've traveled all over the world in covering art.
Right.
from Tokyo to the UK, back home in Australia, here in Boston. How does Boston stack up? I know it's a broad and vague question.
It's a great question, and I meant to touch on it, so I'm glad you've asked. I mean, it's fascinating to me the way Boston has this kind of complex about itself in relation to New York, and it's not surprising. It's certainly not strange or unfamiliar to me, because Australia has that same attitude to the rest of the world. We're so isolated and we're so far away, and so we go through all these sort of mental, or psychological circumlocutions trying to, justify our presence, and phrases like, "Oh, we punch above our weight," and so on, are constantly used. It's strange to me, because Australia has a thriving culture, and it doesn't need to have this sort of insecurity. And I feel very much the same way about Boston, except that Boston has even more reasons, or even fewer reasons, to feel insecure. It really is one of the richest art regions in the world. It's as simple as that. There are few places in this country that can compare with the New England region for richness of offerings in terms of art museums. Probably, obviously New York, probably LA, Texas, perhaps. I don't think even Texas really. I mean, they have some great museums and a great tradition of philanthropy there, but it's more recent, and they didn't have the opportunity to build up the deep collections of things that we have here in Boston, which were only really available at, end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, or right up to the post-war period, I guess. But Boston was so lucky to get so much of that material, whether we're talking about Asian art or Impressionism, post-Impressionism. It's just astonishing how many things we have. A while ago, as a sort of gimmick, I suppose, I did a piece in the Globe which tried to lay out the 50 most important paintings in New England collections, which is absurd, of course. It's ridiculous to rank things, but it was just an interesting exercise in terms of realizing how many really great works of art, paintings, I limited it to paintings, there are in this region. I mean, works that are in demand from other museums all around the world for traveling shows all the time, and which have enormous cultural and scholarly prestige. And that's just scratching the surface, because our collections in so many areas, Asian art especially, I mean, it's such a rich area for Asian art, both at the Peabody Essex Museum and at the MFA. It's just staggering. So, and when you combine that with all these college collections whose collecting policies have often been, universal, in the sense that they'll try, because they're teaching museums, they try and collect in as many different areas as possible. And so they've built up amazing things over time. So yeah, Boston really needs to understand, and New England generally needs to understand how lucky they are to have this. And Europe has obviously great offerings in terms of art museums, but there are so few places in the world that can match Boston. It's extraordinary.
So you said that art was local. It's regional, and it's a theme that we've come back to several times so far this morning. What about what quality of the arts culture in Boston is uniquely different than that of other metro areas in the United States?
Well, that's a great question, and it's hard to pin down. I think one of the downside of being so close to New York, I don't think we need to worry about our museums and the health of our museums and the riches of the offerings that our museums have, as I've said many times. But one of the problems about being close to New York is that because it is the commercial hub of especially contemporary art, certainly of the commercial art scene, which in many ways is a kind of engine of the art world. Artists get to be known by the public, usually firstly through showing in commercial galleries, for better or for worse. Because we're so close to New York does suck a lot of the commercial energy out of out of Boston's art scene. So that if you are, I mean, I guess the shortest and easiest way of saying it would be to say that if you are an ambitious artist or dealer or collector who lives here, you are going to be inclined to go to New York a lot. It would be perverse not to, because of what they have on offer there in their commercial gallery scene. And really, Boston has a very small commercial gallery scene. There are some galleries doing terrific things, don't get me wrong. Very ambitious and very dynamic. But the sheer number of commercial galleries in Boston, and the fact that in New York, and the fact that people flock to New York from all around the world does inevitably steal energy, I think, from Boston. So that's a negative side, but I see so many ways in which people here in Boston are trying to counter that. And many of those people are in the institutions of higher learning, in the colleges and so on, and many are involved in public sculpture, public art. And that's something that this city's been talking a lot about, I think, in the last 6 months. This city hasn't been known for dynamic and interesting and innovative public art. We have some wonderful and historically important old bronze sculptures all over the city. But haven't we seen a huge change in the last year or so? And culminating most recently in Janet Echelman's wonderful sculpture over the Greenway. And I think the Greenway group are doing amazing things in getting public art much more exciting these days. So there's just lots of stuff going on all the time, and I feel more and more and more, and it's generating more and more energy and making us realize that it's not just through the commercial sphere that great things can happen. It's through all sorts of different areas, and Appy brought our attention to one of those areas. I mean, it happens at all levels, and it's incredibly stimulating.
Great. What's trending?
What's
in Boston?
trending in Boston?
Finding Fay.
Finding Fay, exactly.
There's one
Exactly.
thing, so.
No, look, it's a great question. I mean, my eye is mostly on the museums, and so often I notice trends in the shows, the kinds of shows that museums are putting on. I think that painting is coming back in a way. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's never gone away, but I'm noticing a whole bevy of especially women artists, women painters who are enlivening contemporary art in a really exciting way.
Let me interrupt you for a moment.
Yeah.
Are these artists who are born and raised in Boston?
Not
They came to
necessarily,
Boston
no.
from other-
And I should have said that when I had it in mind. But they've been shown in Boston a lot.
Okay.
They're from far afield, but the college museums and the ICA and the MFA have been really bold in showing a lot of these artists, and so that's one thing I notice. It's just been interesting to watch the way institutions have changed their focus and grown and altered things. For instance, the dramatic example is the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis University, which shortly after I arrived here, as a result of the financial crisis that hit Brandeis especially hard, came very close to closing, and they came very close to selling off their incredible collection of especially post-war art, but it goes deeper than that as well. They have an amazing group of, many of you will know, of works by people like Lichtenstein and de Kooning and Marisol and on and on and on. A wonderful collection, the envy of many richer institutions. And seeing an opportunity, the president of Brandeis University talked about selling the collection, and it came very close to happening. Thankfully, they didn't, and it took a couple of years for the institution to get back on its feet. But in the last couple of years, under their new director, they've been putting out amazing shows, really dynamic, really audacious. The last one I reviewed, I guess there's a couple that are just about to open, but the last one I reviewed was it was sort of hinging on the abstract expressionist Helen Frankenthaler, and it tried to use her as a way of kind of telling a different story about post-war American art. It was called Pretty Raw, and it was a fantastic show. And these are the kinds of shows that really get you thinking. And you know, I wish some of the bigger institutions would take on those kinds of shows. I mean, the McMullen Museum at Boston College does tremendous things in that light. And every time I see a show there, I think to myself, why isn't the MFA doing this? You know, why isn't there a Paul Klee show at the MFA? Why isn't there a John Lafarge show, which is the current show at Boston College? So often these smaller institutions are more fleet of foot, and they have the of sort of scholars on campus and so on that they work with, and they often put on bolder and more interesting shows than some of the bigger institutions seem to be able to do. That's a big generalization, and you know, bigger institutions do great things as well, but that's all part of the soup, I suppose.
Now, you talked about what's trending in Boston, and I'm always fascinated by the notion of one region affecting another. So
Right.
what you see trending here, back to the stacking up question, how does that relate to what's trending in other regions that you've observed?
Well,
or does it?
Yeah, well, I just don't know how to answer it in a way. It's,
so is there no pattern then between?
It's often hard to pick patterns. I mean, one of the things that I think we could all say about contemporary art especially at the moment is that it's never been more eclectic. So in a way, to say that, you know, painting's having a comeback, well, you know, I think that's true, and I think that you know, there's greater critical interest, not just commercial interest, because that's always been there, but greater critical interest in painting of late. But at the same time, there's amazing things happening in video art, in installations, in anything you care to name, sculpture and so on. And often, artists today are working in many of these media at once, and that's what makes their work so interesting. I mean, one of my favorite artists at the moment is an Israeli artist, born in Argentina, and now I think she grew up in Israel, and I think she's now living in New York. But her name is Mika Rottenberg, and she was brought to my attention again by a show at the Rose Art Museum. But she's also a big star at the Venice Biennale this year, which I was lucky to see. And she's a video artist who is making such sophisticated, incredibly visually alive work that you can almost read as sculpture. I mean, she has characters in her films who occupy narrow spaces with strange apertures and so on. And you become very conscious as you look at these works of their sculptural presence. And her sense of color is extraordinary, bright palette of saturated colors, often hot pinks and greens and so on. And so here's an artist who's just working at full throttle with a consciousness of so many different areas. Her sort of intellectual interest, I guess, is economics and the way systems of production and distribution and so on work in our modern global economy, which sounds incredibly sort of heady and boring, but she makes it unbelievably interesting and fascinating and stimulating. So, you know, this is indicative to me of the way artists are working today. It's sort of across the spectrum. They're working in different cities and different parts of the world. They're working in Asia, in Africa, in Iceland. I mean, it really is a global art world, in contemporary art especially. So that almost gives the lie to what I was saying about art is local, except that wherever they are working in their specific place. Sure. And then where their work is shown becomes local. So the Peabody Essex Museum puts on a show, and you have to go to Salem to see that show. And it's quite unlike a movie where you go to any cinema or you just stay at home and watch it on Netflix or whatever. You can be anywhere and have that experience. For me, this is the thing I love most about museums and about art, that to see it, you can't see it in reproduction. With very few exceptions, you can't see it in reproduction. You have to go and see the thing itself. And I think there's a relationship that we all have with things, with objects, with works of art, whether they're sculpture or even photographs. I mean, being in the presence of works, there's something about the gap between the viewer and the object itself that has this kind of electrical charge, which you completely miss out on if you just see it in reproduction. So there's a very long-winded and bizarre answer to your perfectly innocent question, so I apologize.
No worries, no worries. I have one more question for you before we take questions.
Sure.
in the realm of fantasy. We
Right.
have a position that is art czar. You were put in that position.
Huh.
Your first year in office. What do you change about the art scene and the arts culture, the arts community in Boston?
Wow. Wow. That is a great question, and
You could even drive people out of town if you wanted to.
I've never had any position of power at all where you actually have responsibility for making change. So I clearly don't go through this thought experiment often enough. Right. Yeah. I think, I often, in my mind, compare the culture of American museum culture, which is so dependent on philanthropy and benefits so much from that, and Australian and European culture, where the philanthropy comes, or it's not philanthropy, it comes from the government almost exclusively. This is a fundamental difference. It makes a huge difference. And it has many ramifications. And by and large, I'd take the American model. And that's because the generosity of people here is astonishing, and that comes out of a deep-seated belief in the value of this stuff. Governments can give money away without really believing in it, and I think it makes a huge difference when that belief is really there, and you give money to things you believe in, and that makes such a fundamental, sort of almost spiritual kind of difference, I think. However, I think one of the things I feel is that there is a reluctance in some of our bigger institutions, which are dependent on this philanthropy, to show work that that tests boundaries and tests sensibilities, that really sort of taxes people's sensibilities as opposed to kind of reassuring and soothing them. Sometimes art can do that very effectively and very productively. It can frighten us. I hate art that shocks for the sake of shocking, and certainly in England there's been a strong culture since the 90s of that kind of stuff, the Damien Hirsts and the artists who were involved in sensation. A lot of whom, mind you, were very, very good artists and remain good artists. That tabloid culture of sensation can get out of hand. But I do feel we could do with a little bit more of something like that, work that really tests people's sensibilities and might have to do with tough subject matter, that really makes us consider aspects of life and society and death that are tough. And I think that there is a reluctance to show that kind of work. And I'm not sure why it is, and sometimes I suspect it's because museums wouldn't want to upset their supporters, the people who pay their bills. I don't know, that's just a theory, but sometimes I wonder about that. As I say, by and large, I would definitely take the American model. But I think that in Europe and in England, they've been more prepared to show that kind of work. But of course, you can then get in trouble with your government if they, and that's happened here, right? When people have shown work that has been seen as too controversial, sure. They've suffered, and things have been shut down. Funding has been cut. Things have been turned into sort of political, soccer balls, if you like. So it's tough. It's really tough. But that's something that I think about a little bit.
Excellent. I've taken too much of your time, so...
Not at all. I've taken too much of yours. Happy, yeah.
How would you isolate, or can you isolate any...
Oh, here you go. Back to the microphone.
Let me see if I can do it. Can you isolate characteristics which differentiate how boomers see art and understand art versus how millennials see art and understand art?
Right. That's a very good question. What am I? I'm somewhere in between, I think, right? Am I Generation X? I think so. I don't know.
You're the
I think we are.
person to ask.
Am I? I wonder. No. I mean, I feel it's a great question, and I think that, and maybe this is always the case. It's just, every generation, the younger generation needs to find new answers for why they should go to museums and see art. I don't think they need to be sold on the idea that creativity matters. I think it's an incredibly creative generation coming up now. And it's a generation that it just doesn't need convincing of that. Creativity is such a buzzword in our society today, almost to the point of becoming a platitude. But it's there because people understand that in our society, for so many reasons, creativity matters. But the platforms for creativity are so many and so various, and so many of them don't require that you leave your house or your small community. And museums are all trying very hard to explain or to encourage younger people to come to them and to make them realize that they can get a huge kick out of being in these places and seeing art in these institutions. And I think many of them are doing a really great job of doing that. And I think that young people are also understanding that you can spend too much time being creative and being exposed to creativity on screens, but there's a different quality to the experience when you see it in the flesh. And they're getting that. I don't think that we need to sort of assume that they just don't get that, because I think that they do. It's just that you still need to entice them and lure them. And that's why I think that showing some art that is actually a little bit more, that's a bit tougher, that speaks to the more existential kind of concerns that young people often have, will be a great way of getting them in. I know Matthew Teitelbaum, who's the new director at the Museum of Fine Arts, the last show that they put on at the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is where he's come from, was a Jean-Michel Basquiat exhibition. And I think that was a show that really spoke to young people there in Toronto and around. And I know that the museum really made the most of it. It was really encouraging young people to come in and see it. So maybe we'll see some more of that kind of thing at our institutions. But I think it's a constant concern, but I think solutions are there, and our best leaders are looking for those solutions all the time. Yes, sir.
The role of art in our public schools. I was thrilled to hear about your wife's experience with music in the Somerville Public Schools. But the focus in our public schools on Common Core, and it's now even, I heard Bill de Blasio yesterday talking about the Universal Pre-K in New York focusing on preparation for Common Core, really at the expense of children's exposure to art and other experiences. And I wonder how we can begin to reverse that tide in this country, because it's I think a real gap.
Yeah, I thank you, sir, for that question. I think it's a great one. I'm the son. I'm not only married to a teacher, but I'm the son of two educators. My father was a headmaster or school principal of a couple of schools back in Australia, and my mother is a linguist who's taught modern languages. My father's a classicist, so for him it was Latin and ancient Greek, and for my mother it was, she's Swedish, and so she taught French and German at school. My sister is a translator, translating from French to English. So we often had these discussions around the dinner table, when I say often, pretty much every night, about how to make people in Australia understand how important languages were. And I think it's the same conversation you could have about music and about art and many other similar subjects, which frankly are getting neglected, as you say, in this drive to sort of, to get back to basics, this idea of getting back to basics. I understand that drive, and I think it is important. And I can see why it has become the sort of mantra of public policy decision makers in the last few years or decades when it comes to education. But it can be incredibly sort of narrow-minded, this idea of getting back to basics. And it can mean that it becomes very hard for other areas like music, where education in music is appalling, really. There used to be everyone had a general sort of grounding in musical principles and in the history of Western music. You know, I'm talking in Western countries, and hopefully in the history of other cultures' music as well. But you know, there was a basic sort of level that everyone could be assumed to have, and that's just no longer there. That common currency is no longer there, and it's a great, great shame. And I think it's similar in art. So how can we change that? You know, we can only keep encouraging it and make people realize how small-minded it can be to just sort of obsess about basics and fundamentals. And hopefully draw in our great institutions into this, into working with schools and communities, which they do. I mean, the Peabody Essex Museum, I keep pointing at Dan Munro, the director of the Peabody Essex, which is such a great museum, and he's been such a great leader, is here. Other museums do that so much as well. The number of school groups that come through is astonishing and growing all the time. That's my impression anyway. And I think that the more these places work with schools, as they do already, the more that will help. But I think we also need to make the decision makers really acutely aware of the benefits of this. And that's where it gets hard, because I'm suspicious of defending art in terms of its utilitarian values. You know, you can do that, and you can make a decent argument that way. But how do you really justify things that also have spiritual value, and that are to do with joy? Yeah, psychic health. I mean, but you know, again, that's almost a utilitarian value. But there are things, at any rate, that are very hard to measure. And yet are so incredibly important. And as we get older, I think we all realize that, don't we? I mean, it just really matters. And you can so easily cut these things out of your life to your long-term detriment. So I think we need to keep talking about these things and push to have them re-included in curricula at schools. I really do. I think it's such a great question and such an important thing for us all to push for. I keep giving incredibly long and probably unhelpful answers to these very good questions, but are there any other questions?
One of the things that you have done is to bring art to the forefront in Boston. I'm always amazed by the placement of your long articles.
You can see the
from
problem,
front
right?
pages to wide double page sections, and I applaud you for bringing art to the forefront.
Thank
One of the questions that I've always had about your writing is, how far ahead do you work?
Right. Well, thank you so much for the question. I mean, I have to say it's my editors who really deserve the credit for backing art. They really, you know, from Marty Barron, who was the editor that both James and I worked under, to the new editor, you know, they really do back the arts generally and visual art especially. I think that they grasp how important visual art is to this community. And so I'm always surprised, as I don't decide the placement of these articles. I'm always grateful and sometimes surprised at how prominent the placement is. In terms of how far I work ahead, you know, having just come back from Australia, I can tell you, I spent, you know, half a day putting together a schedule of upcoming exhibitions. I'm excited about the Strand Beast exhibition coming up at the Peabody Essex Museum. That's very much on my schedule. I just organize it chronologically, and then I work out, okay, so I've got 2 reviews a week plus a frame by frame every second week. And I write up a schedule, and I send it to my editors, and they say, well, this looks good, no problem. Or hang on, you know, that Sunday is actually the Fall Arts preview, so no review there, so rearrange it slightly. And that's how it works. And so then I try and see the show as soon after it's opened as I can, or even before it's open to the public. In Monday, I was in New York to see the big Picasso sculpture show at the Museum of Modern Art, and not even all the works were up yet. I was lucky to get in early to see that. So I was looking at some sculptures still in their crates, which was fascinating, but they were mostly up. So it's often helpful to get there a little bit ahead of time, because, you know, the piece won't appear until Friday. So all these things take a little bit of time to generate. But yeah, it's not rocket science. It's all pretty straightforward, but it does require a little bit of advanced planning. And I think there are busier times of the year. September is always a very busy time. A lot of the great institutions open their best shows of the year, or something like their best shows, in September and October. So it's often very hectic and hard to juggle things to make the reviews appear in a timely way. Yes, please.
I have a quick one about, I know that you talked about the commercialism of sucking the air out
Right.
of artists going to New York, but are there some suggestions in your travels or what you see here of what we as a community can do to make sure that our local artists are more honored and we can be more supportive of them?
Yeah, right. Well, that's a great and vexing question. You know, I didn't mean commercialism in a negative sense. You know, I really do feel that the commercial art galleries, whether they're here or in New York or wherever, they put a huge amount of energy into the art scene, and they back. You know, it's their money. They have to sort of back themselves, and it takes a lot of courage. And they have to have a good eye and pick good artists, and it's through their efforts that a lot of great artists come to light. And unfortunately, because New York is such an economic powerhouse and such you know, for such a long time, it's been you know, probably the center of the art world globally. It sucks some of the energy out of nearby places, at least, towards itself, and even out of faraway places. I mean, every Australian young artist who has ambitions would love to have a show in New York, you know, and some of them are lucky to get them, and that's great. So, you know, it would be great if collectors who are here in Boston frequented Boston galleries more and bought from Boston galleries. But I can understand why they don't necessarily. You can't blame them for wanting to have the widest repertoire of stuff on hand and to see as much as they can and to go to where they know ambitious young artists are showing. And that tends to be in New York, but it's not exclusively New York. What seems to me a more realistic kind of answer is something that I'm seeing happening more and more, and that is our institutions showing more and more contemporary art. The Peabody Essex Museum does that. The Museum of Fine Arts does that. The ICA and Mass MoCA obviously do that at a very high level of ambition. Mass MoCA, by the way, I haven't talked about a lot, but it's also going through huge changes coming up. And it's one of my favorite museums ever. I mean, it's just such a pleasure to go there. It's one of the few museums I can take my kids to where they don't grumble and say, "Dad, not another museum." Not that they're not into it. They do love art, but it can get a bit much for them, of course. But also the university galleries, the college institutions, are all showing a lot of contemporary art. And I think that's great. And a lot of the time they're choosing local contemporary artists, and that's something to be encouraged. I mean, I don't. It's not something I think that people should get single-minded about. That it's all about, you know, building up sort of Boston, and you know, I've got no problem with them showing contemporary artists from elsewhere as well. I think it's all good mulch, you know, and people will find their place. It's about the quality of the art. But I think it's encouraging that our institutions, which are really the strong suit that Boston has, are prepared to do this more and more, as well as showing historical stuff. All art, I mean, I really do believe all art is contemporary. It's about how we respond to it in the moment, and if it's not speaking to us anymore, then, you know, fine, get something else and pull it out and show that. But I mean, we are so lucky to be able to stand in front of, you know, an ancient Egyptian sculpture at the MFA or an extraordinary, you know, bronze Buddha at the Peabody Essex Museum, and feel the way it speaks to us right now here in this moment. Because there is no other moment. There's the present, right? And that's what is so special about encounters with art. So, any other questions, please?
One more.
Yes.
The role of art schools vis-a-vis art museums.
Oh, there you go. Nothing. The role of art schools vis-a-vis art museums. You've touched on a very topical subject, and that's right. It's a great question. They have a relationship. The most famous relationship between an art school and a museum in this area, of course, is the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, which is right next door to the Museum of Fine Arts. And it's topical because I gather that at the moment, and I don't know if a decision has been made or not, but I gather that there's been talk of the two institutions decoupling, splitting. As I say, I really don't know the state of those conversations, and it may not happen. But it has a grand tradition and a fascinating tradition. Many great artists have gone through the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. And you can't help thinking it would be a shame. Other great museums have institutions, art schools attached. I think of, for instance, the Art Institute of Chicago, which has a great and famous art school which has produced many, many interesting and successful artists. It's about how you make the two work together, I guess, and that's the tough thing. And I know that the Museum of Fine Arts has tried various ways of working together, and they've had a continuous relationship. I'm not sure if they've had the mix quite right in the last 10, 20 years, but it's tough. It's difficult because there are two different beasts in many ways, and it can be a burden on one to sort of have to support the other, and it can be just annoying for the other to have to be under the control of the museum, for instance. So it's not simple. But I do know that the many art schools that we have in this region are lucky to have so many great museums that they can take their students to. It's as simple as that, and be engaged with. And it's also great that artists get employed by these art schools. Museums often also employ artists, but above all, it's art schools that do that. And I think that's great. Benefit. The artists who are employed there benefit from having a regular income of sorts, and so it should be a win-win. But it can get complicated. Institutional politics and money, of course, become very complicated. It's not easy. All right.
Thank you. No more questions from you.
Oh, yeah, please.
Oh, just an observation and a thank you. You've made a huge difference to the art criticism of the city. And
That's very kind.
as appreciators of art and as lovers of art, you've made it really fun to pick up the newspaper and read what you're saying, because
thank
it
you
hasn't
so
happened
much.
here before, and it's one of the reasons why I think art hasn't developed in Boston the way one would have hoped. The contemporary scene, yes, I think the museums have done a great job, but I really do believe that the community art centers, the work that Fay Chandler did,
Yeah.
They
play a huge role.
the Maud Morgan Gallery in
Yes.
Cambridge, all these little hidden gems that
The
really
Concord
don't
Art
get any
Association. There's so
they
many.
don't get
Yeah.
exposure.
Right.
And it's really, I raised an artist, she went to the museum school, the whole
Really?
business.
Yeah.
It's the world I love, and I spend my whole summer in the Berkshires so I can take advantage of Mass Smoker
Right,
on
yeah.
a weekly basis. But I just think we need that energy in the city, and you are one of the reasons that, and I hope now with the new director at the Museum of Fine Arts, who seems to have communal energy, we're going to be able to turn the tide a little in Boston, because I do, I am an old New Yorker, and so it's a hard heritage to give up.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
do believe that we need to bring some of that here, because I think it will encourage the schools. We need to bring back art to the schools. And
Yeah.
when the New York Times does the front page of the News and Week in Review on creativity, we've got a leg up. This
Right.
is our time.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
thank you for helping manage that for us. 'Cause
Oh, look, for me, it's a privilege to do. I know it might sound sort of, a bit feeble, but honestly, it's a true privilege for me to do the job I do. I feel really grateful both to the Globe and to my editors for backing it, and thank you so much for those kind comments. But for me, yeah, I just feel so lucky, so thank you. Thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And thank you to James. Thanks so much for inviting me.
all of his wonderful and thoughtful responses to what are very energizing and inspiring questions. These are the exact questions I've been hearing over the past few weeks as I've been doing a bit of a listening tour. I'm Allison Esposito. I'm the new director for the arts program here at the Boston Foundation. I'm just a month into the role. I'm very excited to meet all of you. I've shaken a few hands, but I welcome the opportunity to speak with you a bit more before you leave today or in the future with Julie in the back of the room. I came from Chicago just a few weeks ago, and I'm thrilled to be here. There seems to be a really interesting energy right now. We have, a mayor here who is really having arts at the head of his agenda. It's one of his top 3 priorities. He has articulated the ways in which arts and culture are truly connected to his vision for the city going forward, which is really exciting. He has, for the first time at the cabinet level, an arts person, an art czar, Julie Burrows, who I will say I did work with in Chicago before coming here, and I'm very excited to partner with again. There's an energy that's very, very tangible, and it's what drew me here, and I can feel it in the room. I'm honored to hear more about your mother. I've heard about her actually since my first day on the job. I've been hearing about her all over the community. Her vision and her generosity is something that is going to be felt for a long time, and I'm honored to meet you. I have a background in the arts. I started my career in management consulting, but I'm a dancer. I started dancing at age 3. I come from a family of artists. We have artists of all kinds in my family. There's a comedian, there's an actor, there's a pianist, there's a singer-songwriter. So we have all kinds of artists. And it's been the thing that I have loved and done with my spare time forever. And about 10 years ago, I decided to merge my day job with my passion, and I started in philanthropy doing arts and cultural work, and then I was working for the City of Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events most recently to help them revitalize their grant-making programs to serve actually the needs of individual artists and to be more specific about individual works of art, which I think was a theme I heard resonating today throughout the conversation. I just wanted to introduce myself and say thank you for being here. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. You've all given me a great deal to think about, and I welcome the chance to meet you again. Thank you.
That's the end. Thank you all very much.